When you need mealtime inspiration, it's worth shopping Kroger for thousands of appetizing ingredients that inspire countless mouth-watering meals. And no matter what tasty choice you make, you'll enjoy our everyday low prices. Plus, extra ways to save, like digital coupons worth over $600 each week and up to $1 off per gallon at the pump with points. So you can get big flavors and big savings. Kroger, fresh for everyone. Fuel restrictions apply.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 490, Between Stalin's Hammer and Hitler's Anvil. Last time, on December 26th, Army Group Center's commander von Kluge sent a request to Hitler to pull back his southern section, something to help bring continuity back to Felber's and Enrichi's forces, and thus shore up the right flank. Even better, Kluge wanted to pull back the entirety of Army Group Center, but Halder, the chief of staff, was too afraid of Hitler to ask anything. Sensing this, Kluge ordered the pullback himself, the entire line. The question was, would it be enough? This latest pullback started on December 27th, but by December 30th, Kubler, 4th Army's new commander, was asking Kluge for permission for another. On that day, Kubler told Kluge there was about to be another Soviet breakthrough at Borovsk, about 60 miles or 96 kilometers southwest of Moscow. Kubler reported the situation simply, the divisions can no longer hold. This put Kluge in a tough spot. Yes, he needed to order the retreat to save his forces, but if he was seen as constantly pulling back, he would get the sack. So a middle way was needed, i.e. a pullback followed by resisting for a while, followed by another pullback. It was far from ideal and would cost him lives, but it was the only way, considering the unrealistic expectations of Hitler. Thus, he told Kubler to hold on for a few days and that he would contact HQ again to ask permission for another withdrawal. Now, far be it from yours truly to suggest that Hitler was of sound mind, but an argument can be made that when his thrust to knock Soviet Russia out of the war failed in late 1941, he started to further distance himself from reality. Currently, for him, a most unpleasant thing, I think we can all agree. For when Hitler heard of Kluge's most recent request to retreat, he petulantly responded, why, we might as well back up to the Polish border, or that Kluge did not understand that a leader had to command with cold reason, which was the equivalent of saying the tenets of National Socialism would somehow provide the means to overcome equipment shortages. But then De Fuhrer took this idea to a whole new level. He told Kluge, each time we retreat, we lose material. Thus, if we retreat too much, we will lose everything, and thus be defeated. This was him, in some form of panic, taking a fact to its illogical extreme. Of course, that was not the case, but as Hitler, had no better argument, he went with a logical fallacy. The call ended between the two men with no agreement. Then Hitler called Kluge an hour later and said that the 15th Division of Lieutenant General Hell will stand where he is. This was the unit at Borovsk, southwest of Moscow, about 50 miles or 80 kilometers north of Kluge, that had started the entire question. Kluge replied, I'll send Hell reinforcements, but it's only a matter of time before the 15th Division isn't there anymore, either through its destruction or because it pulled back. Either way, Hitler ordered that the 15th would not retreat. Meanwhile, there was the enemy to contend with. Now, technically, Hitler had only given permission for Kluge's southern end permission to retreat, As covered, Henrici's 48th Army Corps was pulling back to Kluge, and Felber's 13th Army Corps was retreating to the northwest. That was helping those two, but it wasn't doing anything in terms of a stop action against the Russians, nor help close the gap between them. If anything, their pullback was only increasing the gap. So Kluge ordered Nobeldorf's 19th Panzer Division to head south and close the gap. But moreover, if timed just right, the 19th might just slam into the flank of the charging Soviets' attack there. This worked out as hoped on December 28th. The hole was plugged. And yet, this did nothing to fill the wide open area below Henrici's formation that was some 80 kilometers or 50 miles just covered. And so Russian units were closing in on Kluge. Soon, it would be surrounded with the 48th Army Corps within it. The pullback averted one crisis, but another was looming. But was it? For the devil is always in the details. The closest threat to Henrici's men was Russian cavalry. Normally, they would travel with infantry to offer balance and combined punching power, but such was Stalin's drive to push back the enemy or to envelop them, the cavalry was ordered to go on ahead. So, were there enemy units nearby? Yes. Were they a dire threat to a well-set-up defense? No, mostly to the supply lines, which was one reason why Kluge was trying to pull back, to negate that threat to his supply lines. It was a game of chess, where all the moves needed to be within a larger framework. One German soldier, Benno Zeiser, who would go on to write of his time on the Eastern Front, covered the folly of cavalry charges in the modern era. Dozens of mounted Russians suddenly appeared and made a frontal charge. That opened the Russian attack. But after the Germans' machine guns opened up, Benno would then write, their riders were shot out of the saddle, some of them dangling by one foot in the stirrups. But then things got worse for Henrici's 48th Army Corps. Though the Germans could not possibly know this would grow and affect the war, on December 29th, 90 Soviet airborne troops parachuted down to a spot about 30 miles or 48 kilometers due west of Kluge, i.e., behind them. Henrici wanted to bug out because clearly Soviet troops were surrounding his position. Now it seems even retreating might not be enough. But first things first. Back on December 26th, he had ordered that his 3,000 Soviet POWs start marching west. Those that could not keep up were eliminated on the spot, which gruesomely left a trail, not unlike breadcrumbs for any who wanted to follow. And the oncoming Soviet troops most desperately wanted to follow.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.
Back to December 29th, Kluge knew he could not abandon a major city like Kluge without Hitler's permission, so he rang him up. They went back and forth, as before, with Hitler worried about the loss of equipment, while Kluge uncategorically stated, if we do not fall back, there will be no one left to handle those weapons. Hitler knew he was right and approved the retreat right there and then. But things were different now, even from retreats just a few days ago. When the 48th Army Corps pulled out of Kluge, they weren't heading into uncontested territory. No, again, Soviet troops, and not just the paratroops, were already behind them. Yes, Henrici's northern or left flank was once again secured, as it was reconnected to the rest of 4th Army, but his southern flank, that was withering as the days went by and letting entire enemy divisions go past them to the south, to get in behind parts of Army Group Center. As one of Henrici's men put it in his diary, the time of the encirclement of German units began. As bad as this was for Kluge, and it was bad, getting worse, his left flank started going the way of his right flank. Early during the retreat from Kalinin, General Adolf Strauss's Ninth Army had done a solid job of backing up, staying intact, while delivering losses to the enemy. But each time Ninth Army lost men too, and the accumulative effect was starting to kick in. Still, as General Ivan Konev rained armies down on Ninth Army, it continued to hold off the enemy while backing up, hoping to reach the Staritsa line. As touching Army Group Center, this would be their winter defensive line within the city and going south in front or east of the Volga River. True, they would surely still be attacked, but the idea was to build fortifications to take some pressure off the exhausted Germans. And they would have to build their own defenses because there was nothing there at the moment, nor did nature lend a hand at Staritsa. As Strauss backpedaled, he figured out pretty quickly there was no way they could keep up this level of fighting while constructing any barriers. For Konev would not let up on him, because Stalin would not let up on Konev. There was nothing for it but to ask for permission to back up further to Rzhev along the Konigsberg line. For the Ninth Army, this meant Rzhev about 15 miles behind Staritsa. Some work had already been done there for defense. But Hitler had said yes, for now, as many times as he cared to, and he told Strauss no and to make the best of his situation. For reference sake, the Konigsberg line ran thusly: Rzhev, Gizhak, Orel, Kursk, north to south. So the preparation and building started at Staritsa, all the while dropping the tools to take up weapons each time the Soviets appeared. And that December, they attacked several times a day. In 3 days of fighting, one infantry division lost 438 men with no reinforcements forthcoming. The math explained the rest. If this pace kept up, the infantry division, nay, all of them, would be down to dozens of men, and then the Russians would truly overwhelm them. But that wasn't the question, was it? As Kluge kept asking himself, would his men give out while defending before the Soviets gave out while attacking? The Ninth Army's war diary recorded, "The next 2 weeks will decide if the army is to be or not to be." OKH Chief Halder mirrored this with his own note: Ninth Army begins to crumble. True enough, but did that goad him to speak to Hitler about another pullback? No, which meant, again, Kluge was the only one speaking up and asking the unpopular question: can we retreat further? Not that the Russians had it any easier. A defecting Soviet officer told the Germans that his men had not eaten for days, that frostbite was killing men every day, but the order from Konev, from Stalin, was always attack. The day after Christmas, the attacks came again, along part of the line that was being held by the German 6th Infantry Division, where 200 men fended off 1,000 Russians, who simply ran forward. The German machine guns started to fire. Russians started to fall. The attacking force stopped, regrouped, and started charging again. The machine guns started up again, and this went on for 5 hours. After the Russians melted away, the Germans found that they had only lost 4 men, and 6 more were wounded. A lopsided victory, to be sure, but those 4 dead Germans would never fight again, while Stalin was still calling up young men from around his massive country. After Christmas, corps commanders were begging Strauss of the Ninth Army to retreat, but he said no, because Kluge would say no, because Hitler would say no. But Kluge would step into the breach once more. For now, Ninth Army and Army Group Center in general was told to stand fast. When darkness came and the temperatures really dropped, the men of Ninth Army ran into whatever house or building they could find, which meant that 1, if the Soviets attacked at night, and they did, they seldom got past houses as many Germans were inside ready to shoot. And 2, with German soldiers going inside to stay warm, their line had many gaps in it. This was taken advantage of, but that was tomorrow's problem. While men like Strauss, Reinhardt, and Hoppner were fending off requests to retreat, Kluge went back to Hitler to ask for permission to back up to the Königsberg Line. This was on December 29th, and Kluge spun it to say, "We are dying where we stand. But if we back up slowly and stay active, the Russians will follow us, making it easier to kill them. And when at the Königsberg Line, that's where we will make our stand, as defensive works are already being built. We will bleed the enemy right in front of us." But Hitler denied this request. One, the panzers of Reinhardt and Hoppner did not have enough fuel to fall back enough to keep constant with Ninth Army. And two, Hitler had received a very flawed report saying that things weren't really all that bad. Yet December 29th was notable for other reasons as well. Until Kluge got a yes from Hitler, he ordered Strauss to stay put, and the latter agreed, but not the commanders under him. That same day, at least 3 divisional commanders told their men to be ready to retreat and no counterattacks. We don't want anyone far out in front when we execute retrograde movements. Defying Hitler created colorful phrases. Sensing this breakdown in command and control, Kluge was back on the phone to Halder on December 30th and the 31st, asking for permission to retreat to save Army Group Center, which is when Halder had to admit on the 31st that he had not actually passed on Kluge's request, for it would be shot down. Which is when Kluge tore into Halder, like the Soviets were currently doing to Ninth Army. Yes, Kluge used facts, but he also implemented venom and frustration. This resulted in Kluge getting a chance to finally speak to Hitler hours into the new year. Hitler said no again, to which Kluge replied, "Well, Strauss has already ordered Ninth Army to pull back." Now, this wasn't technically true, but the group leader was trying to present it as a done deed. Not surprisingly, Hitler yelled into the phone for the next hour. The upshot of this diatribe by Hitler was that Strauss would order Ninth Army to stop where it was and stand, and that Army Group Center would not retreat, not anymore. Kluge was bereft of options and energy, so he relented. But by now, events had taken over. Near Volokolomsk, about 40 miles or 64 kilometers west by northwest of Moscow, near Hoppner's Panzer IV Group, 2 Soviet regiments were too close to continue the retreat. No, here the panzers had to stop and make a stand or die running. So the day was spent with the panzers pushing hard, killing hundreds of enemy troops, who would then be reinforced and set off again, their momentum gaining them ground. Yes, both sides lost men, but the Germans would pull in more panzers to hit harder in a specific spot, and the process would only repeat itself. But the next day, the Soviets changed their attack. As the panzer crews readied themselves for another enemy wave, the Soviets focused their attack on the nearby 106th Infantry Division, and they broke through. Now, the panzers had to stay in place, for if they went chasing after the Soviets behind them, the enemy in front of them would push forward, and it would all begin to unravel. So, Hoppner asked Reinhardt for an assist in the form of a relief force. It took a few days, but those 10 panzers sent by Reinhardt not only chased away the immediate threat, they retook some hills that the Soviets were attempting to set up artillery on. Even better, the Soviet breakthrough was now encircled. Now, it was time to crush it, which is when a Soviet relief force came in strong to save them. The German relief force was able to hold the ground that day against the Soviet relief force, but it cost them 9 of those 10 panzers. Pyrrhic victory, to say the least. What had just happened was typical of December's fighting. The German troops, exhausted and shivering, were overwhelmed by more numerous enemy troops rushing at them and breaking through. But what the Germans knew was that should have only been phase 1. The breakthrough had to be followed up by other units who were ready to rush into the gap to create even greater chaos for the enemy. But that was not happening. The Soviets and their commanders were simply thrilled just to be penetrating the German lines at all. And considering how the fighting had been going since June, that makes sense. But the time would come, and soon, when someone in a Soviet uniform realized this and had rested troops ready to go, waiting for that breakthrough. And then, for the Germans, all hell would break loose. Thus, for now, the threat to Army Group Center wasn't just taking place on both ends. No, parts near the line's center was starting to crack. Yet Hitler held on to his belief that this could be turned around. Basically, the Blitzkrieg had not worked, and he and his generals were at a loss as to what to do now. But whatever they came up with had to factor in the winter, which had just started. Postscript. Stalin knew of Japan's attack on U.S. territory before it happened, thanks to his numerous spies like Richard Sorge in Tokyo. But did he tell FDR? Did he tell Churchill? No. Why should he, as he wanted them on his side? From June 22, 1941 to December 7, 1941, there seemed to be moments of when Washington and Tokyo would reach some kind of deal. This liked Stalin not. Fortunately for Stalin, the Japanese point of view and mentality would not allow them to back down. And in early October, observers could confirm that Japanese troops were moving away from the Soviet-Manchurian border. Clearly, they were going to be shipped somewhere else. And during that same period, Stalin authorized 11 Soviet divisions, 1,800 planes, and 1,000 tanks to be transferred from the Far East to Moscow. Yes, it would take time for these men and machines to get into place, but soon the Rasputista rains came, and the enemy's panzers had trouble moving until the ground froze, and by then, the defenses around Moscow were much improved. So Stalin's capital was now much better protected, but his far eastern flank was weaker. Thus, it would be best if Japan actively and soonest attacked the United States. So Stalin said to Sorge, who had access to the Japanese Prime Minister Konoye through a breakfast club and unofficial advisory board, to suggest that Japan should take from the Western powers rather than trying that with Soviet Russia. After all, look what happened at Nomonhan, aka Galkin Gol. As the Battle of Moscow got underway, FDR made it clear to his cabinet that he was willing to bend over backwards to avoid war with Japan, that he would strain every nerve to satisfy and keep on good relations with Japan, which is the last thing that Stalin wanted. So he had his spy, communist sympathizer Harry Dexter White, a senior official in the U.S. Treasury Department, brought up a list of demands for the Japanese in Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s name. These demands would become known as the Hull Note for Secretary of State Hull. Surely they would be ignored, and war would come. Japan rejected the Hull Note on December 1st, and a week later, as preparations had already been made, Pearl Harbor was attacked. But going back to the Battle of Moscow, its series of crises can be looked at like this. By mid-October, it seemed as if Moscow would be entered by the Germans. Then the rains came, and by the time the ground froze, the Siberian divisions started getting into place. And by the time Stalin's counterattack was launched, tanks and planes from the United States and Britain had already started arriving in Soviet territory. The great single thrust that was to have decapitated Communist Russia was thwarted by human resistance, human assistance, and Mother Nature. Quite the odds to overcome. Between June and November 1941, Stalin had lost over 20,000 tanks to the enemy. In December, some 500 tanks had been delivered by the United States and Britain. Further, British tank instructors were close to the front lines to teach Soviet crews the best way to employ them. And even before December, the U.S. had sent over 200 Tomahawk P-40 fighters. And in December, U.S. ships landed with 342,680 tons of supplies, including aluminum, tin, lead, nickel, and rubber, along with 2,186 trucks for Soviet soldiers. This does not include the millions of barrels of aviation gasoline, 5,000 field telephones, 20,000 kilometers of telephone wire, 11 million pounds of barbed wire, and tons of machine guns with shells, and 1,500 tons of boot leather. All these numbers would grow as the U.S. built up its own forces while still supplying the British as well. If one may be excused for mixing timelines, as the line in the TV show The Wire goes, "When you come at the king, you best not miss." Well, Hitler had missed. The question now was what to do next. But the man in Berlin was not thinking that way, but rather he was thinking Blitzkrieg 2.0. But when the spring of 42 came, he would find the game had changed. Everything had changed. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So, it's late Tuesday night. Sorry about that. I'll do the thanking members and those who donated next time. I just want to hurry up and get this out. I still have to edit it. So, you will hear I will thank all those people next time. So, take care as always. Be good to each other. People in Florida, please be careful. And everybody else, just remember Christmas is around the corner. So be nice to each other. Take care.
Hey, history lover. You're listening to this podcast because you like great storytelling and learning from the past. Airwave History Plus is your ticket to the most popular history shows anywhere with ad-free listening, bonus content, early episodes, and more from 27 top podcasts, including History That Doesn't Suck, The Explorers Podcast, The History of World War II, Queen's Podcast, The Age of Napoleon, and many more. To get your free 7-day trial, go to the Apple page for this podcast and click subscribe. That's Airwave History Plus, the essential audio destination for history lovers. Available now on Apple Podcasts.